Hi, I'm Danny Wetzel, and I'm going to be going over Section F from the Test Content Outline Behavior Assessment. I'm going to go over some domains of the test content outline that influence conducting behavior assessments, as well as evaluate some ethical considerations. So first off, I want to differentiate an FBA from an FA. So a functional behavior assessment is an umbrella term over all of the indirect and direct assessment methods that we use, versus a functional analysis is an experiment that systematically contrives different establishing operations to study their effect on a targeted behavior. And this is important according to Hanley and others in 2003 for determining the actual function of a behavior and ruling out either contingencies that are not at play for the targeted behavior or identifying multiply maintained behavior. And this is going to help us promote the development of function-based treatment. Additionally, Dozier and others provided some recommendations for how to conduct functional analyses and some methods that can help you customize them to the resources of the setting that you're in and individualize them to your client. And this is important, so I'm going to review them later when we go over F6, because the literature reports, and in my experience, a lot of behavior analysts shy away from FAs because they're worried that they're too complicated or they take up too much time. But I want to assure you that that is not the case, so we're going to dive into that later so that you will feel confident also conducting functional analyses. But first, we're going to talk about gathering records at the outset of the case. At the outset of a case, you're going to need to gather medical and educational records or notes of history from previous services. This is going to give you important context to developing what other assessments you need to conduct and just getting to know your client a little bit better. Additionally, I would recommend administering the ACE or Adverse Childhood Experiences questionnaire. This goes over things like if the client has ever experienced food insecurity, loss of a parent, any type of abuse, and being aware of this trauma or aversive experiences that might be in the learner's history is going to be really important for developing a trauma-informed approach so that we're not doing any harm. We know our code tells us that we need to work in the best interest of our clients and avoid harming them in any way. So being aware of these experiences is going to really help us to be mindful as we're selecting what assessments we're going to proceed with. Additionally, throughout your interviews, you're going to learn about your client's strengths, what skills they already have under their belt, and then also what deficits they have, what things that we might be able to close the gap on with our behavior services, or learn about any challenging behavior that prohibits them from functioning in their natural environments. We're also going to need to learn about relevant cultural variables. This is going to be important so that we can identify how the current client and their stakeholders may differ from our own culture and values and of different of any other clients that we've previously served. Being aware of this is going to help us check our personal biases so that we can adjust and treat this client accordingly. And then also it's going to help us to know what education we need to gain to close the gap on any barriers that we might have to serving them. Skills assessments are a huge piece of developing a treatment plan. A lot of times in ABA, we're going to be serving clients that have autism or intellectual disabilities. So common assessments to assess different language and verbal behavior or learning skills, daily life skills include the APLS, VB-MAP, ABLES, PEAK. And then when you're selecting what type of assessment you're going to do, you're going to consider things like your client's age, any diagnoses that they have, and then what matters to the family and their stakeholders, and then what matters to the client themselves. You know, do they want to be able to go function in a traditional classroom? Are they trying to go get a job? Do they want to be able to communicate their needs more efficiently, things like that. So depending on the goals of the client and their stakeholders might help inform you of what assessment to use in addition to things like their age and diagnoses. In our assessment process, we're also going to be using preference assessments. These are different than reinforcer assessments. I just want to put that note in there. But preference assessments are really important for establishing a hierarchy of preferred items that our clients have. So free operant is going to be the most simple to complete. You're just going to observe your client in their natural environment and record what items they engage with and the duration of that engagement. The longer the duration, the more preferred the item is. You could also choose to do a paired stimulus preference assessment. This will involve presenting two items and then selecting which one the learner picks. And then whatever is selected most often is going to be their most preferred item, and so on and so forth. You could also do a multiple stimulus with or without replacement. The example that you see here, this data sheet, is showing a without replacement preference assessment, which forces them to choose something besides their most preferred item, which may benefit your client. And going through these will help you determine, again, that hierarchy of their preferences. You may choose which type of preference assessment depending on the skills that your learner has. For example, do they have the ability to make a choice, or do they have the ability to scan an array of 3 or more items? So different things like that are going to influence which preference assessment you choose to conduct. Next, we're going to talk about descriptive assessments. So descriptive assessments are things that we're directly observing as behavior analysts. So we're not taking the hearsay information from their educators from school or from their caregivers. Instead, we are going to directly observe the behavior ourselves of the client. And this might involve taking ABC data. So for example, if I'm looking at a hitting behavior, I might record common antecedents and then graph those as you see here. So in this example, denied access was the antecedent, the behavior that the client engaged in was hitting, and the consequence was prompting a functional communication response. After you have a good sample of ABC data, then you can graph it like I was showing you here in these bar graphs. So let's say that this most common antecedent was denied access. That might inform my hypothesis that their hitting behavior is functioning to get them access to preferred items or activities. But let's say that you cannot inform a hypothesis, or maybe your hypothesized function and the treatment that you developed is not working. That might lead you to conduct a functional analysis. So a functional analysis, like I mentioned, is that experiment that we're going to do to specifically target one behavior and determine the function. Reminder, this is the gold standard of assessments in ABA, so you don't want to shy away from this resource. I'm going to talk about some of the recommendations that Dozier and others provided from their paper in 2021. First off, we're going to want to consider the risks of a functional analysis, considering things like the adverse childhood experiences that might be at play, considering the risks of injury if the behavior is something like aggression or self-harm, considering what it's going to be like for the client to be exposed to these treatment conditions. So we're going to want to consider all of these things and conduct a cost-benefit analysis before we proceed. If we're determining that a functional analysis is worth it, we really need to pinpoint the function of this behavior with this methodology. Then we're going to think about what's the most appropriate type of functional analysis. So there's different methods that we can do. Like I mentioned, you can cater it to the needs of your client or the resources that your setting has. So we can do things like a traditional functional analysis or a brief functional analysis. And there's literature that reports that doing a brief functional analysis, maybe 5 minutes per condition versus the traditional 15, will produce just as reliable results. So this could make it more efficient to complete the functional analysis, as well as be potentially more ethical by limiting the exposure for the implementers and the client of the functional analysis conditions. We could also do things like select either a trial-based or a latency-based functional analysis. So there's lots of different ways that we can customize the FA to make it the most appropriate and ethical for the client and setting that we're in. Then you're going to select your conditions. So depending on the behavior, these may vary. For example, if you're doing an FA on aggressive behavior, it would not make sense to include an alone condition to assess an automatic function, because if they're alone, there's no one that they can aggress towards, so that would be irrelevant. So things like that will play into the conditions that you select as you're designing your functional analysis. After your design is complete, then you're going to obtain informed consent. Informed consent involves no coercion and full transparency of all of the risks and benefits of conducting the functional analysis. And then you also want to make sure that the stakeholders and client know that they can revoke their consent at any time for this procedure. Then, as you're conducting your functional analysis, I recommend that you graph in real time. This is going to also be an ethical decision because it's going to help you limit the exposure to, let's say, excessive rounds of the course of the experiment that are not needed if a function was able to be determined in the pattern earlier in the responding. So we're going to want to graph in real time. And then as we're evaluating, we're going to want to make sure that you're familiar with different types of experimental designs and how to assess them and visually analyze them. So experimental designs for functional analysis might include things like pairwise, reversal, multi-element. Here in this example, you can see a multi-element design of a latency based functional analysis. So the behavior that was studied was aggression. The sessions were capped at 5 minutes. A brief session was chosen to avoid the risk of exposing for an excessive amount of time. And then here on the y-axis, you could see the latency or time until it took the client to engage in aggression. And then here we have our session number. In the top right corner, you can see the legends, which indicate which session is in effect at that time, what condition we were assessing. So you can see during our control condition, we had no responding, no instances of aggression, which is great. Because as we're evaluating and conducting our visual analysis, we can see that there was differentiation between our other test conditions versus the control condition. And this is huge because we can tell that this behavior is multiply maintained. There's a really strong evocative effect in the escape condition and the access to tangibles condition, but we know that this client will also engage in aggression to get attention. So this behavior is multiply maintained by escaping demands, getting access to tangibles or preferred activities, and gaining attention. And that's kind of how you would go through evaluating the data from your functional analysis. And you can see here that we only had to do 16 sessions total. So 16 5-minute sessions. We were able to complete this in 2 hours. Which is great because then we didn't have to go on for days and days and expose the client and the implementers to unnecessary risks. All right, F7 goes over interpreting assessment data to determine the need for behavior analytics services, or if we need to refer them to someone else. Hot take, ABA might not be the most appropriate thing for everyone. I'm a firm believer that just because you have autism doesn't mean that you need ABA. Just because we could serve a client doesn't mean that we're the best option for serving them. So when you're considering this, think about what are their primary deficits. If they have a large amount of physical deficits, it'd probably be more appropriate for them to see a physical therapist. Something else that should really come into play is the personal and cultural values that influence the course of treatment. So would their caregivers be willing to attend caregiver training? Are they open to learning? Or do they have that availability to take time to complete those sessions? If the prescribed amount of ABA hours is going to impede them from going to school, what's the cost benefit of that? Is it okay for them to be missing out on that educational time or being around typically developing peers? Things of that sort are going to be really important to consider as you're deciding if behavior analytics services are the most appropriate for the client that you're assessing. And then F8 talks about interpreting your assessment data. So once we've decided that the client is appropriate for ABA services, it's time to develop our treatment plan. So we're going to be reviewing this assessment data to identify and prioritize socially significant, socially valid goals. So we want to consider what matters to the client and their stakeholders. Are they really worried about being able to build communication goals? Are they really worried about functional living skills? Do they want them to be able to initiate and sustain play with peers? Things like that is going to be really important when we're pinpointing what parts we're going to pull out from our assessments and what goals we're going to create. Additionally, we're going to think about what did we observe during the assessment that was impeding their ability to learn, constricting those learning opportunities, or things that might be limiting their quality of life. Maybe it's something that the caregivers didn't consider, but that we could share with them, hey, we could teach them how to independently complete XYZ, and that might really change their quality of life. And then additionally, while we're creating treatment plans and making client-informed goals that are socially valid, we're going to think about our results from the functional analysis. So we're going to think about what's maintaining the challenging behaviors that we might be seeing, and how can we manipulate the environment to better support our learners and set them up for success? What replacement behaviors can we teach them so that they can get their needs met without engaging in that challenging behavior? So those are different considerations to have as you're interpreting your assessment data. Thanks so much. These are my references if you wanted to dive any more into the sources that I used, or I can be reached via email. Happy assessing and good luck to you all.